In a moment that has rewritten 1,000 years of history in a single, chilling heartbeat, Buckingham Palace has dropped the ultimate mask. The announcement that many feared, yet few dared to speak aloud, has finally been made official. King Charles III has confirmed his sudden abdication from the throne. This is not merely a change in leadership. It is a seismic collapse of a reign that was supposed to last decades, now cut short by a health crisis far more devastating and advanced than the palace machine ever allowed the public to see. For months, the nation was fed a carefully curated narrative of business as usual, of a king dedicated to his red boxes, despite his personal trials. But today, that polished spin has shattered into a million pieces, leaving a nation in a state of profound disbelief and a constitutional monarchy teetering on the edge of an existential reckoning. The statement released from the palace was surgically precise, stripped of the usual royal warmth and filled with a cold, heavy finality that sent immediate shockwaves across the globe. It wasn't just a health update, it was a surrender. As broadcasters interrupted regular programming and news tickers turned a somber red, the atmosphere in London shifted instantly. The silence hanging over the gates of Buckingham Palace was not the silence of respect, but the silence of an institution in shock, a system that had reached its absolute breaking point. Observers noticed that this wasn't the slow, dignified transition the British public had been conditioned to expect. This was a truth dragged out at the last possible moment, a desperate move by a man who realized that his mortal struggle could no longer be hidden behind the everything is fine optics of the court. When the one person who humanizes the crown, the king himself, is forced to step away to survive, it raises a question that haunts every corridor of power. What did Charles see in his private reflections that terrified him more than the prospect of bad headlines? Across the country, the reaction has been one of heartbreak mingled with a growing sense of betrayal. People are asking why it took this long to be this honest. If a king has to overrule his entire court just to tell the truth about his inability to continue, then the problem lies deep within the gears of the monarchy itself. The fairy tale is gone. In its place is a raw, fragile reality of a family and a country forced to confront the fact that even a king can bleed, and even the most ancient institutions must eventually face their own mortality. For months, the world had been watching a carefully orchestrated shadow play. The narrative was one of planned procedures and routine recoveries. But behind the heavy oak doors of Sandringham and Clarence House, a far more desperate struggle was unfolding. This wasn't just a period of medical rest, it was a period of systemic paralysis. The silence that emanated from the palace was not the peaceful quiet of healing, but the stifling silence of a cover-up reaching its inevitable limit. Schedules for the future king and queen were cancelled with increasing frequency, and every time the public asked a basic question, the response was a repetitive mantra of privacy, space, and recovery. Insiders now reveal that during those missing months, the atmosphere within the royal household turned from concern to outright panic. Senior advisors and medical specialists were seen entering through side gates at odd hours, their faces etched with the kind of gravity that no PR spin could hide. While the official photos attempted to project a sense of stability, those within the inner circle saw a different reality. Applying the lens of physiognomy, the study of physical signs revealing internal truths, insiders noted the alarming change in King Charles. The vibrant, dedicated sovereign was being replaced by a man whose skin had taken on a translucent pallor, whose hands, once steady during the most grueling of ceremonies, now possessed a subtle, involuntary tremor. The physiognomy of the crisis was written in the vacant glances during private meetings, and the weight that seemed to have vanished from his frame almost overnight. It was the silent language of a body, telling the story of internal rifts and failure that the palace machine tried so hard to censor. The conflict between the cold demands of royal protocol and the raw reality of human vulnerability had reached an impasse. Courtiers were fighting to manage the optics, while the king was fighting to simply endure the day. This period of secrecy didn't protect the crown. It created a content gap filled by conspiracy and dread, proving that in a public institution, silence is not a shield, It is an admission of a crisis that has already spiraled out of control. As the crisis deepened within the sovereign's private quarters, a parallel war was being waged in the briefing rooms of Buckingham Palace. This was the moment the monarchy's script began to fail, and the brutal machinery of the institution turned inward. For weeks, a fierce conflict had been brewing between Prince William and the king's most senior advisors. The palace's old guard, obsessed with protecting the brand and managing perception, insisted on maintaining a wall of total opacity. To them, the king's health was a constitutional liability that had to be suppressed at all costs to avoid a crisis of confidence in the financial markets and the Commonwealth. But for William, watching his father wither behind the velvet curtains, the optics-first strategy had become a form of cruelty. The tension reached its breaking point during a late-night emergency summit. Sources close to the household describe a scene that shattered the myth of royal composure. In a room filled with the scent of old leather and the weight of centuries of protocol, William reportedly stood up, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and fury, and declared that the family deserved more than silence. He was no longer speaking as the heir to the throne, but as a son watching the palace machine prioritize a hollow image over a human life. This wasn't just a disagreement over a press release, it was a fracture in the very family the institution claimed to protect. The prince argued that by hiding the truth, they weren't preserving the monarchy, they were hiding how close they came to losing the emotional center of the crown. While this internal battle raged, the mask began to slip through a series of unauthorized leaks. Whispers from the London clinic and whispers from the staff, who saw the vacant glances of a king in pain, began to permeate the media. An email with the subject line, "Enough is enough," reportedly circulated among the household's inner circle, signaling that the "we've got this under control" narrative had finally collapsed. The public was beginning to sense that the fairy tale was rotting from the inside. This was the turning point where the king himself finally intervened. Recognizing that his mortal struggle could no longer be sacrificed for the sake of polished palace lines, Charles reportedly overruled his entire court. He saw that the silence in a public institution had become a poison, and he made the decision that would change the world. He would stop hiding, even if it meant admitting the crown was no longer invincible. The moment of finality did not come from a constitutional council or a committee of high-ranking ministers. It came from a man looking at his own reflection and realizing that the throne had become a gilded cage for a mortal whose time was running out. For King Charles III, a man who lived his entire 70-plus years by the iron laws of royal protocol, the decision to walk away to choose abdication over a slow, televised decline was the ultimate pushback against a system that demanded a fairy tale even as the walls were cracking. He understood, perhaps more clearly than any of his predecessors, that a monarchy which cannot admit its mortal vulnerability is an institution that cannot survive the 21st century. This wasn't transparency born of a new philosophy. It was truth dragged out at the last possible moment because the gears of the palace machine were finally grinding to a halt. Insiders described the final confrontation between the king and the men in gray suits, the advisors who have spent decades managing the optics of the crown, as a turning point in history. While his team insisted that he continue to serve as a figurehead, essentially managing the perception of stability while he underwent grueling treatments, Charles reportedly chose honest vulnerability over the polished palace script. He saw that the silence in a public institution was creating a crisis of trust far more dangerous than the abdication itself. Applying the lens of reading the room of the public heart, the king realized that the people were no longer satisfied with everything is fine narratives. They wanted to see the man behind the mask, and what they found was a king who was finally willing to say, enough. The psychological weight of this decision cannot be overstated. By abdicating, Charles didn't just update his medical chart. He fundamentally rewrote the monarchy's script for future generations. He transformed the crown from an ancient institution that must pretend nothing ever breaks into a modern test case for human resilience. He moved the focus from the what of royal duty to the how of personal survival and institutional integrity. This act was a confession that the monarchy can bleed, and that in the race between the palace machine and human survival, humanity must eventually win. The king chose to overrule his entire court, to tell the world a truth that was as fragile as it was courageous, that even a king must step away to survive. The abdication of King Charles III didn't just end a short, transitional reign. It detonated a constitutional bomb in the lap of Prince William. For his entire life, William knew this day would come, but he never expected it to arrive under the dark cloud of a medical surrender and institutional panic. The transition from heir to monarch is usually a time of solemn mourning mixed with continuity. But this sudden shift feels like an emergency rescue mission. William is no longer just stepping into his father's shoes. He is being asked to repair a foundation that has been deeply cracked by months of secrecy, strategic leaks, and administrative paralysis. The fairy tale transition has been replaced by a raw, cold reality. The crown is now a burden of survival rather than a symbol of triumph. Insiders close to the Prince of Wales describe a man who is resolute but profoundly burdened. The weight of the crown is no longer a metaphor for him. It is a physical, exhausting reality that has aged him visible in a matter of weeks. While the public sees a future king who is ready to modernize the institution, the private William is grappling with the fact that he is inheriting a wounded monarchy. His rise to power is inextricably linked to his father's physical decline, a reality that makes the victory of the throne feel like a bitter personal loss. Using the lens of reading the body, observers have noted the change in William's public appearances, the tightened jaw, the weary shadows under his eyes, and a gaze that seems to be searching for an exit that doesn't exist. He is a man who hasn't slept since the crisis moved from the private medical wing to the constitutional throne room. The constitutional machinery is now working overtime to legitimize this abrupt handover. But legal perfection cannot mask the emotional void. William's struggle is the ultimate emotional death point for the public. He is the son forced to take the keys from a father who is too broken to drive. This isn't the triumphal entry of a young conqueror. It is the somber acceptance of a duty that has suddenly become a life sentence. The prince knows that the eyes of the world are searching for a sign of strength, but behind the palace walls, he is fighting a war between his loyalty as a son and his duty to a crown that demands he move on before the previous reign has even been fully mourned. The brutal machinery of the monarchy waits for no one, and for William, the cost of the throne has never been higher. While Prince William grapples with the crushing weight of his new reality, another figure stands in the epicenter of the storm, her influence as undeniable as it is invisible: Queen Camilla. In the brutal history of the House of Windsor, Camilla has always been a survivor, a strategist who understands that, in the game of crowns, emotion is a luxury the institution cannot afford. As King Charles III's health crisis moved from a private struggle to a public abdication, insiders suggest that it was Camilla who became the architect of the transition, the cold voice of reason that prioritized the brand over the individual pain of her husband. She is the Shadow Queen, a woman who has spent decades navigating the treacherous currents of royal optics, and now she faces her final, most difficult performance. Sources within the palace describe Camilla's role during the secret abdication talks as clinical and corporate. While the family crumbled around her, she reportedly focused on one thing: preservation. Applying the lens of institutional survival, she allegedly warned Charles and the senior courtiers that sentiment cannot overrule succession. To her, the monarchy is a fragile business, and the sight of a lingering, weakened king would be a fatal blow to the optics of power. This wasn't a betrayal of love, but a brutal act of loyalty to the crown's image. She pushed for a clean break, a sudden exit that would allow the institution to reset before the public's sympathy turned into scrutiny. Her language in these closed-door meetings was reportedly stripped of sentiment, focusing instead on constitutional liabilities and market stability. However, this cold calculation has created a profound and icy divide between Camilla and the new king, William. The friction between the mother who wants to protect Catherine, even from the sidelines, and the queen who wants to preserve Camilla, has reached a fever pitch. William reportedly views Camilla's insistence on a swift abdication as a lack of compassion for his father's personal dignity. The Shadow Queen now finds herself isolated within the very palace she helped stabilize. She has become the face of the brutal machinery that William is so desperate to humanize. As she prepares to step back into a secondary role, the silence between her and the new regime is louder than any press release. She has secured the future of the crown, but in doing so, she may have permanently fractured the heart of the family. The cost of her calculated silence is a monarchy that is safe, but a household that is cold. While the Shadow Queen Camilla focused on the survival of the institution, and Prince William struggled with the burden of his new destiny, it was Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, who became the unexpected moral compass in this constitutional desert. Often regarded as the steadiest, most stoic hand in the House of Windsor, Anne has built a reputation on her unwavering adherence to duty and her refusal to engage in the emotional theatrics of the tabloid press. However, as the secret of King Charles's abdication moved from a medical necessity to a corporate optics strategy, something inside the Princess Royal snapped. She became the only figure willing to challenge the cold, clinical efficiency of the palace machine. Seeing the human cost that Camilla's strategy had so conveniently ignored. This wasn't just about a change in the line of succession. It was about the stain on the monarchy's soul that comes when you treat a dying king as a PR liability, rather than a brother, a husband, and a man. Insiders reveal that in the weeks leading up to the final announcement, Anne made a series of discreet, late-night visits to her brother. Slipping past the cameras and the staff with her trademark precision, she was the only one who didn't come with a briefing paper or a strategic update. She came to listen. What she witnessed during those hours, the mechanical calm of her brother and the visible exhaustion in his eyes, shattered her assumptions about the path forward. She realized that the palace was not protecting Charles. They were erasing him while he was still breathing. In a closed-door meeting that has since become legendary among the high-ranking courtiers, Anne reportedly confronted the transition team, her voice low and sharp as a blade. She didn't argue about constitutional law. She spoke about the legacy of humanity. "We lost Diana because no one listened," she allegedly warned the room. "Are we about to lose the king's dignity because we are too afraid of the truth?" Anne's intervention created a brief, flickering glimmer of doubt in the abdication machine. She challenged the idea that a monarch must be invincible to be valid. She argued that the public would respect a king who said, "I am ill and I need to rest," more than a palace that said, "Everything is fine while the curtains are drawn." This was the ultimate clash of the titans. Anne's raw, historical perspective against Camilla's corporate brand management. For a few days, it seemed Anne might delay the inevitable, forcing a more compassionate, transparent timeline. But the machinery of the crown, once set in motion, is almost impossible to halt. Documents were already being drafted. Legal experts were already rewriting the future. Anne's reckoning didn't stop the abdication, but it ensured that the silence would never be total. She stood as a witness to the human truth, a reminder that behind every crown there is a pulse that protocol cannot regulate. But beyond the emotional pleas of Princess Anne and the silent grief of a son, the machinery of the crown required something more permanent, something irreversible. While the family was still reeling from the medical reality, the legal architects of the monarchy were already at work in the shadows, crafting the most consequential document of the century. This was not a simple letter of resignation. It was a surgical restructuring of succession, a royal decree issued with a chilling finality that stripped away the ambiguity of the past few months. The document itself was cold, clinical, and timed with predatory precision. It didn't just end Charles's reign. It effectively rewrote the destiny of every person in the line of succession, shifting the tectonic plates of power without a single public debate or parliamentary vote. Legal experts who have since unearthed the implications of this decree describe it as a constitutional surgery performed without anesthesia. The language was deliberately opaque, cloaked in high court jargon designed to confuse and deflect, but the core message was impossible to misread. The monarchy had decided to prune its own lineage to protect its image of strength. This is where the story takes its darkest turn. Reports suggest that the document contained a clause that moved power with unprecedented discretion, effectively bypassing traditional waiting periods and setting a new, dangerous precedent. If a king can be removed due to health complications in such a rapid, secretive manner, who decides the criteria for the next removal? The question of consent hangs over this document like a shroud. Multiple sources allege that while King Charles signed the papers in a state of physical exhaustion, Prince William, the very man set to benefit, refused to lend his signature to the specific clauses regarding the efficiency of the transition. The fracture in the family had now become a fracture in the law. William's refusal to sign was not just a moral objection. It was a desperate attempt to signal to the future that he did not approve of the brutal machinery that had sidelined his father. He recognized that by allowing this decree to stand unchallenged, he was accepting a crown that could, one day, be taken from him or his children by the same calculating forces that were currently erasing Charles. The document now sits in the public record as a testament to a monarchy that prioritized image over innocence and control over compassion. It turned a family tragedy into a constitutional mystery, leaving the world to wonder, who truly benefits from the king's absence? Was this a move to protect the crown, or was it the final act of a shadow government within the palace walls, ensuring that the next generation inherits an institution that is untouchable but utterly soulless? While the constitutional scholars argue over fine print and the legal decrees are signed behind closed doors, the true casualties of this sudden abdication are found in the nurseries and schoolrooms of Kensington Palace. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis are no longer just children playing in the gardens of a royal estate. They are the involuntary witnesses to a system that is consuming their grandfather and reshaping their father before their very eyes. For Prince George, now the immediate heir to a burdened throne, the weight of his grandfather's surrender is a terrifying preview of his own destiny. He is seeing, perhaps for the first time, that the invincible crown he was born to wear is not a fairy tale prize, but a weight that can break even the strongest of men. The mask has fallen, and what remains is the chilling realization that in this family, the institution always comes before the individual. Princess Charlotte, known for her sharp intuition and fiercely protective nature, has reportedly become the quiet observer of the family's emotional decline. Sources within the household describe a new, heavy tension in the sibling dynamic, a silence shaped by questions that no child should have to ask. When they see their father, the new King William, return from late-night summits with hollow eyes and a gaze that seems to have vanished into a distant, weary sorrow, they are learning a brutal lesson that the throne does not bring happiness. It brings a duty that demands the total sacrifice of family peace. The psychological burden of this transition is impossible to quantify, but its effects are visible in the way the children have withdrawn from the public eye. They are being raised under a shadow, where love from the nation is presented as conditional upon their perfection and their utility, to a crown that has just proven it can prune its own members the moment they become a liability. Outside the palace gates, this internal trauma is reflected in a seismic shift in public perception. The fairy tale narrative that the monarchy has depended on for centuries is being replaced by a far darker, more cynical reality. A younger generation, already skeptical of inherited privilege, now sees the royal family not as a symbol of national unity, but as an institution unwilling to protect its most vulnerable members from the brutal machinery of power. The poll numbers are shifting with a speed that has left the palace press office in a state of paralysis. The question is no longer just, why did Charles abdicate? But, is a system that demands this much human suffering even worth preserving? The facade of grace and tradition is cracking, revealing a cold, corporate entity that prioritizes optics over the pulse of humanity. The monarchy may have secured its immediate future through this abdication, but it has done so at the cost of its soul, leaving a legacy of shadows for the children who must one day inherit what remains of the ruins. As the silence settles over Buckingham Palace once again, only one haunting question remains. Is this the end of a reign, or the beginning of the end for the monarchy itself? This wasn't just a decision about one man's health. It was a loud, chilling message from the institution to its people, and perhaps even to itself. What does it mean when the crown prioritizes image over innocence, and corporate stability over the pulse of humanity? When the monarchy reveals a truth so sharp, it cannot be softened by pageantry or masked by tradition, the world is forced to look at the brutal machinery behind the gold. The sudden abdication of King Charles III is no longer a procedural footnote. It is a permanent rupture in the story the palace tells about itself. For decades, they claimed to evolve and to modernize. But here we are again, watching a family bear the cost of a legacy steeped in control and cold calculation. Constitutional scholars and the public alike are left staring at a dangerous precedent. If a sovereign can be effectively erased in silence, who truly holds the criteria for power? The monarchy's legal framework allows for flexibility, but public trust is not a flexible thing. A younger generation, already skeptical of inherited privilege, now sees an institution unwilling to protect its own vulnerable members, where love and belonging depend entirely on perfection and utility to the brand. The psychological burden being passed down to George, Charlotte, and Louis is a debt they never signed for, a shadow that suggests their place is conditional upon their silence. The fairy tale has been stripped of its magic, leaving behind a corporate entity that manages perception, while the human heart of the family is sidelined. The loudest echoes, however, come from the past. Many remember Diana's warnings that the institution protects its own survival before it protects the people within it. 30 years later, her words are no longer just a memory. They are the indictment of the modern crown. The facade is cracking. The public is watching more closely than the palace ever anticipated. And for the first time in history, the crown may not be the one writing the final narrative. In the monarchy's most carefully guarded halls, a king's fate was rewritten in cold ink, and the echoes of that decision will haunt the House of Windsor for generations to come. The throne is occupied, but the pulse of the monarchy has never been harder to find. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next deep dive.